The first words that shattered me on my 76th birthday were not congratulations, but condemnation. My son David stood before a hall filled with family, friends, and neighbors, raised his glass, and with a smile that cut like a knife, announced, a stranger beside him as his true father. I can still hear the applause that followed, confused and scattered, the whispers rushing across the room like wildfire, while I sat frozen at the head of the table, the cake untouched before me. My name is Elias Monroe. I am 76 years old. For 50 years, I worked as a carpenter, running a small woodworking shop in Ohio. My hands built doors that still hang in the houses of this town, tables where families still gather, benches where old couples still sit at dusk. Those hands were celebrated once, praised as steady, honest, and enduring. And yet, on the very night when my children were supposed to honor my life, my craft, and my sacrifices, I was stripped of my dignity by my own flesh and blood. David Monroe, my eldest at 46, had built his fortune not with tools, but with contracts and deals in real estate. He often looked at me as if my trade belonged to the past, something outdated, as though honest work had no place in the modern world. That night, his disdain became public theater. Beside him stood Gregory Shaw, a man I had not laid eyes on in decades, yet one whose presence dragged me violently back to another era. Gregory, once a rival in my trade, now paraded in my son's spotlight as the man who had supposedly given David life. The room gasped. Some laughed in disbelief. My daughter Claire, standing awkwardly near the cake, dropped her wine glass, its shatter piercing the silence that followed. She was 43, a woman often caught between loyalty to me and the ambitions of her brother. Her eyes darted to mine, wide with confusion, but she said nothing. The weight of David's proclamation pressed upon me, heavier than any beam I had ever lifted. I sat still. My body did not betray the storm inside me. I had carried lumber through winters, endured splinters buried deep in my palms, hammered until sweat blurred my vision. Pain was not new to me, but nothing, not even the years of labor that had bent my back and stiffened my knees, had prepared me for the humiliation of being erased in front of my own bloodline. David clasped Gregory's shoulder, introducing him, not merely as a guest, but as family. The man who should have stood where Elias stands, he said with venom disguised as charm. The words struck harder than any blow. I watched my neighbors whisper, men who once hired me to build their porches, now raising eyebrows. Women who once praised my craft, now staring at Gregory as if a ghost had been resurrected. I scanned Gregory's face. He was 71, still, carrying the air of arrogance I remembered from younger days. His hands were smooth now, his shoulders less broad, but his eyes carried the same hunger for recognition that had once driven him to undercut me on contracts and gossip behind my back. I knew then this was no accident. This was a staged attack, orchestrated not only by David's disdain, but by Gregory's long-nurtured bitterness. The celebration continued, but not for me. The candles burned low on the cake as voices grew louder, laughter rising at the expense of my silence. Children played at my feet, unaware of the fracture splitting the family above them. Claire remained by the wall, torn between the duty of defending her father and the fear of provoking her brother's wrath. Vanessa, David's wife, moved like a hostess in triumph, her smile sharp and rehearsed, guiding guests toward Gregory as if introducing a long-lost patriarch to be admired. She had always sought control, always eager to wield money and appearances as weapons. The insult cut deeper because this gathering had been meant as a testament to my years. 76 winters survived, 76 summers endured, each marked by work that left its scars on wood and flesh alike. I had expected gratitude, perhaps a simple toast acknowledging the life I had lived. Instead, I was served betrayal baked into the very fabric of the evening. Neighbors approached me hesitantly, some offering pats on the shoulder, others muttering platitudes they didn't mean. Their eyes betrayed the questions forming in their minds. Had I lied all these years? Was I truly the father of my own son? The room smelled of roasted meat and spilled wine, yet to me it reeked of suspicion. A stench stronger than sweat from the hardest day in the shop. I sat quietly, because silence was the only dignity left to me. My instinct was not to shout, but to remember. I remembered David as a boy, sitting on my lap as I sanded a chair, watching the shavings curl to the floor. I remembered teaching him how to measure twice before cutting once, how to drive a nail straight without bending it. I remembered the nights I stayed late in the shop to pay for his schooling, the meals I skipped so he might eat better. Each memory rose in my mind only to be crushed under the weight of his betrayal. The guests grew bolder as the night dragged on. Some approached Gregory, shaking his hand, congratulating him as if his sudden claim to paternity was something to celebrate. Others cornered me with prying eyes, eager for scandal. I answered no one. My mouth was a locked chest, my pride the only thing keeping me from collapsing under their gaze. Claire approached me at last. She bent low, whispering, "Papa, I don't understand." Her words trembled, not with disbelief in me, but with fear of David. I saw in her the conflict that would haunt her in the days to come. The pull of loyalty against the force of intimidation. The cake remained uncut when the evening ended. Guests trickled out, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. Gregory lingered, his smirk carved deep into his face, a man reveling in the ruin of another. David stood tall beside him, chest out as though he had conquered something, though what he had destroyed was his own blood. When the last light was turned off and silence filled the hall, I sat alone at the table. The candles had melted into stubs, the frosting of the cake hardened and cracked. The chair beneath me creaked as I leaned back, staring at the empty room. For the first time in my life, I felt not just old, but unnecessary, as though my presence was a burden to be cast aside. Yet deep inside, beneath the humiliation, a small ember of defiance glowed. I had built my life from wood and sweat, and I knew what it meant to repair what was broken. That night I was fractured, but I would not remain so. I would bide my time, gather my strength, and when the moment came, I would reclaim the truth that had been stolen from me. The hall had echoed with betrayal, but I promised myself it would one day echo with justice. By morning, the congratulations cards lay unopened on my kitchen table, their cheerful typeface mocking the silence in the house. I needed coffee and distance, so I walked to the diner where I had eaten after long days. At the shop, back when sawdust still clung to my jacket like a badge, the waitress set the mug down without asking. She had known my order for years. When I reached for my wallet and slid my card across, the machine blinked and returned it as if my name no longer belonged to me. She tried again, slower this time, and shook her head with a sorry look that made my stomach tighten. I paid with the bills I kept behind my license and left a tip too large for a man who had just been told he couldn't afford his own coffee. Outside, the morning had a hard edge. Trucks roared past on the highway, carrying new prefab panels headed to job sites where men measured by spreadsheets rather than by grain and weight. I walked to the bank because the walk steadied me. The branch manager recognized me as the man who had built her porch years ago. She smiled in the courteous way bankers do when the lobby is quiet. She asked how she could help. I told her I needed to see why my account had stalled. She typed, paused, typed again. Her polite expression settled into the kind of official distance that means policy has stepped into the room. She explained that certain changes had been registered and that I should call the number on a notice that would arrive by mail. She said it without wobble, a line rehearsed exactly once to keep her on the right side of her job. When I asked if the money I had saved from years of work was still mine, she told me the bank could not comment until a trustee responded. I thanked her and left, carrying no answers, only the echo of a word that had no place in my life: trustee. The mailbox had no notice yet. What it did have was a glossy flyer from my son's company, promising luxury homes with clean lines and easy maintenance. The photo showed a couple standing on a deck that looked like wood but wasn't. It was a composite that would neither crack nor tell stories. I set the pamphlet aside and wrote the word trustee on a scrap of paper, underlining it twice. I had never trusted a piece of paper to think for me. A tool fits the hand or it doesn't. A paper can be made to fit any hand that pays enough to. Folded by noon, the ache in my knees had flared, so I stopped at the pharmacy. The pharmacist knew me well enough to pack my refill before I reached the counter. When the same card failed a second time, the people in line turned away as if privacy could be gifted by staring at the floor. The pharmacist offered to hold the pills until I sorted things out. I shook my head, pulled a jar of quarters and dimes from my coat pocket, and counted until the bottle slid across the counter. That was the image everyone carried out with them: an old man paying for his own bones with coin-shaped memories. It was not pity I felt pressing around me, it was a shame. Placed there by someone else's hand, I walked the long way home. After the pharmacy, a stranger would have called a ride. I needed the street to think. I passed the church where I had built the toddler benches 20 years earlier. They were still straight. The maintenance man nodded from the steps and asked if I would be interested in looking at a broken pew. I told him to call the shop line. It rang in an empty building now, but I wanted the message on that machine to keep speaking my name. The house smelled faintly of cedar oil and coffee gone cold. On the kitchen table, beside the cards and the flyer, lay the small ledger I had, kept like a companion since my 20s. I wrote the date in the margin and recorded the breakfast and the medicine, not because I needed the book to tell me where the money went, but because writing it down held the day in place. A man who records his work can find it again when others try to wipe it from the wall. In the afternoon, a car door closed in my drive. My daughter stepped out, carrying a paper grocery bag and a folder under her arm. Claire had become careful. Over the years, careful with words, careful with the balance between her brother's gravity and my stubborn gravity. She walked in like someone approaching a porch with a loose step she didn't want to announce. She put the bag on the counter and began unpacking fruit and bread, the quiet, domestic kindness that says more than speeches. When she finished, she set the folder beside the ledger as if the two belonged together. Claire is my daughter, 43, principled in a soft way that holds firm until too much pressure is applied. She told me she had checked on me because last night had been a disaster and because the family needed time to cool. She said David had been dramatic, that a public scene helped no one, that she was sorry I had been blindsided in a room meant for celebration. She spoke like someone trying to hold water in a cracked bucket. Then she gestured to the folder and told me there were forms. The family lawyer had suggested we sign to help manage things while emotions ran high. I opened the folder and saw words designed to look harmless. One document was a medical evaluation. Request for a routine wellness check. The kind clinics push on folks my age to keep us from falling through cracks. Another was a springing power of attorney asking to take effect upon a doctor's letter. A third named something called the Monroe Family Trust, under which my accounts would be administered by a trustee for my welfare. The intended trustees. Name did not surprise me. There is a kind of inevitability to ink once a pen decides it is brave. Claire explained that this was temporary, that it would make bills easier while the family resolved the mess from the party, that it would keep reporters or gossips from turning a private situation into a spectacle. She did not say I was in danger. She said the family was in danger of embarrassment. She described how a friend of hers had used a similar arrangement to help her mother when she was recovering from a fall. She told me I would still be consulted. She also told me that in the meantime, certain safeguards had been triggered to keep accounts secure. It was a smooth story built for someone who does not read ledgers. I asked who had suggested the safeguards. She said the attorney had coordinated with David because he managed finances well and because he could keep things orderly. She did not look at me when she said it. Her fingers pressed the edge of the folder as if it might slice. She was not a co-conspirator. She was someone standing between two moving vehicles, hoping both would stop before they reached her. I did not shout. I asked her to leave the folder. She hesitated, then slid it toward me as though laying down a burden. She told me she would come back the next day to pick it up and bring it to the attorney. She did not issue an ultimatum. She asked for trust, not in me, but in a process that had already decided my place. When she left, the kitchen felt smaller, not from her absence, but from the size of the paper left behind. I read each line until the words stopped blurring. The grant of authority was broad. It allowed management of accounts, real estate, and personal property. It permitted the trustee to open and close accounts, to sell assets, to make distributions for my welfare as deemed appropriate. It used phrases like best interest and reasonable needs, phrases that could be stretched like wet leather to fit any shape. A physician's letter would activate the power and the trust fully. The physician's name was pre-printed with a blank beside it for the signature. The blank waited with patience. Before dusk, I drove to the shop because walls that I had raised could still hold me up while people tried to take away my footing. The building sat at the end of a lane off the county road, once loud with saws and laughter, now quiet enough to hear my own breath. I rolled up the bay door and let the light in. The workbench, with its worn groove, fit my hip the way a saddle fits a horse that has carried the same rider for years. On the pegboard, the handplane sat where it had sat for decades, its wooden handle polished by use, its blade set exactly as I liked it. I ran my thumb along the grain of the bench and remembered every board that had sweated in my hands until it stopped resisting and did what it was made to do. I laid the folder on the workbench beside the plane and thought of the difference between trust and control. A tool does not require consent. It requires craft. A legal instrument could be swung like a hammer by anyone strong enough to lift it, regardless of whether they understood the house they were striking. I did not make a speech to the empty room. I slid the documents back into the folder and tucked it under the bench. It did not belong in my kitchen beside the ledger. It belonged where I could measure it against something real. The phone on the wall, a relic with a coiled cord, still worked. I called the clinic to schedule a routine check for my own records. I wanted my numbers on paper before anyone else wrote over them. The receptionist offered an appointment 2 days out. I wrote it in the ledger. If someone planned to use a letter to declare me unfit, I would meet the letter with another letter. Not argument, evidence. Near sunset, a courier truck turned into my drive as I returned home. The man handed me a thick envelope, the kind attorneys prefer, addressed to me but written in David's office font. Inside were notices stamped received by the bank that morning. Acknowledgement of a trust information. Notification of a temporary freeze pending trustee verification. A letter sent to the county recorder requesting a preliminary review of titles. Associated with my name, there was also an invitation to a meeting at the attorney's office at noon the following day. It stated that this would be an informal conversation regarding family estate planning, and that my presence was encouraged. To avoid misunderstandings, I poured coffee I did not want and stood at the window watching light leave the yard. Across the street, a neighbor taught his boy to throw a football, the slow arc of the pass bright in the fading day. The boy dropped it and laughed. The man laughed too. It was the ordinary sound of continuity. In my house, continuity had been pushed into a folder. I arrived at the attorney's office early because I have always preferred to be the first one in a room that might judge me. The reception area smelled of lemon cleaner and old carpet. Diplomas hung on the wall, frames straight, names in proud fonts. The assistant asked me to wait. When the door opened, my son walked in with a posture that said he intended to win. He greeted the assistant like a man entering his own lobby. He did not look at me right away. The attorney followed, a woman I had seen at Chamber of Commerce lunches, smart, efficient, eyes that measured liability. She introduced herself and offered water I did not take. She laid out the plan as if presenting a reasonable structure that would shelter everyone. She described how the trust would preserve my assets, reduce taxes, ease decision-making if I became ill. She used phrases about modernizing old arrangements. She spoke of responsibilities that came with age and the prudence of planning. She said it all with professional kindness, the way a doctor tells a patient a bone will need setting. When she finished, she asked if I had questions. I told her I had many, but one in particular, who had authorized the bank freezes without my knowledge. She explained that preliminary holds could be placed when there was risk of confusion or conflict, that it protected me as much as the bank. David finally turned to me. He said the family needed structure after last night's chaos, that it would be simpler if he took care of the logistics, that he had the experience. He said Claire agreed. The attorney nodded toward a signature line where Claire's name appeared. As a proposed co-trustee, conditional on my consent. I thought of my daughter holding the folder like a hot skillet and understood how pressure can be applied without leaving marks. The attorney scheduled a capacity evaluation with a clinic she trusted. She said it was a formality. She was efficient. The appointment had already been placed on a calendar. She slid me a copy. My signature was not demanded. It was expected. I walked out without signing and drove to Claire's townhouse because a father's question deserves to be asked where the answer must be faced. She opened the door before I reached the top stair. My daughter stood with her hair pulled back, worry braided into it. She tried to explain in a rush that she wanted what was safe, that she did not want to choose sides, that she feared what David would do if I refused. She said he had reminded her of the mortgage he had helped her refinance last year. He had reminded her that the business world did not wait for feelings. He had told her the town was watching and that I would be grateful later. She left out the part where he told her to get my signature. She did not need to say it. The empty spot on the page in the folder said it for her. This was the one moment in which I allowed something like argument to enter the room. Not raised voices, not accusations, just the simple measure of right and wrong placed on the table between us. I told her in plain words what I believed about responsibility, about the difference between helping and controlling, about the cost of comfort when it requires another person to surrender their name. I spoke not as a man demanding allegiance, but as a man asking his own child to remember who had taught her to hold a line that slides under pressure. She listened, her eyes filled and cleared. She said she needed time. She promised to read the documents again. She promised to call. She stood uncertain in her own hallway, while two loyalties pulled at her sleeves. That was the hinge of the day. Not victory, not defeat, but a daughter deciding what kind of daughter she intended to be. Night laid itself over the town as I turned toward home. On a sidewalk near the square, I passed a storefront where a new kitchen showroom had replaced a hardware store that once smelled of oil and adventure. In the window, a display board explained surfaces that looked like stone but weren't, wood that looked like wood but wasn't. The city had gone glossy. Gloss does not hold a nail. At home. I placed the attorney's packet next to my ledger and slid the folder Claire had left under it. I locked the door, not out of paranoia but out of muscle memory. I cleaned the kitchen as if company were coming, because order is a kind of prayer even when no one hears it. Before bed, I opened the old cigar box where I kept small tokens, the first house key from the shop, a brass hinge from a church cabinet, a photo of my wife on the day we hung our first sign. I added the pharmacy receipt to the box. The coins had done their work. They would do it again if they had to. In the dark, I pictured the hand playing on the pegboard and felt a steadiness settle where panic had tried to live. They had moved money and paper. They had not moved the truth that my work was my work. Tomorrow I would call the bank's legal department and ask for the specific statute under which the freeze had been placed. I would call the clinic and ask for the doctor's qualifications. I would ask for copies of every document someone claimed to be in my best interest. I would give no one my anger. I would give them the patience of a man who had learned to square a frame before he nailed it. The day ended with a small scene no one saw but me. I set my ledger flat on the table and pressed my palm over my name. The skin of my hand is lined like a map that tells the story of every board I ever lifted. A trust can inventory numbers. It cannot inventory calluses. If the world intended to measure me by paper, I would force it to read my hand first. I woke the next morning to the sound of gravel crunching under tires. From the window I saw a black SUV in my drive, the kind leased by those who like to arrive in silence but leave in command. Out stepped Vanessa, my son's wife, dressed for business though the sun was barely up. She carried no groceries or greetings, only a leather case and the tight smile of someone convinced she was about to improve a situation by taking it over. She let herself in as if the house already belonged to her. She looked around, not admiring, but assessing, measuring walls and floors, making silent notes about what could be stripped, painted, or sold. She poured herself a glass of water, sat at my table, and unfolded papers from the case. Without asking if I wanted to listen, She began to explain that things would be easier for everyone if control were consolidated, that assets should be streamlined, that a clear hand at the helm was necessary. Her voice had the cadence of real estate pitches I had overheard too many times, phrases about maximizing value, modernizing use, reducing inefficiency. She told me she and David had been advised by the attorney to secure key holdings so they could not be challenged or squandered. She spoke of my accounts, my land, the shop, and even the tools that had not been touched in months. She called them legacy items, which in her mouth meant liabilities. She produced documents transferring authority for these matters to the trust, with her name appearing beside my son's as primary managers. She pointed to the line where my signature was expected, her manicured finger tapping like a gavel. I did not pick up the pen. I asked her if she had ever held the hand plane that rested on my workbench, if she had ever felt the weight of oak against her shoulder, if she had any idea how many nights I stayed late, sanding until the wood accepted the finish. She waved the questions away like sawdust. She said sentiment could not balance ledgers, that markets respected efficiency, not memory. Her words were smooth, but her eyes betrayed impatience. She wanted me to bend quietly, to sign and retreat into the small corner she thought suitable. For an old man, when I did not answer, she adjusted her tone, feigning concern. She said David worried about my health, that I had been under strain, that the world could be cruel to those who refused to adapt. She insisted this was protection, not theft. I stood, not to argue, but to show that my body could still hold itself tall. I gathered the papers and placed them back in her case. I told her the shop was still mine, the accounts still carried my name, and the house still echoed my steps. I said no decision of consequence would be made at a kitchen table at dawn. Her smile thinned. She packed her case and told me delays only created confusion, that the community already whispered, and that her patience was not endless. She left, without slamming the door, because slamming would have admitted defeat. I drove to the shop to breathe air not yet poisoned by signatures. Dust lay on the counters, but the scent of wood still clung to the beams. I sharpened the hand plane, though I had no wood prepared, simply because the rhythm steadied me. Each pass of the blade against the stone reminded me that some edges cannot be dulled by neglect, only by surrender. That afternoon, the bank manager called. She said politely that she had received additional instructions from the trustee regarding certain titles. I asked which trustee, since I had signed no such appointment. She hesitated, then mentioned Vanessa by name. I told her plainly that no authority had been granted, that any such instruction was premature at best, fraudulent at worst. The pause on the line told me she understood but could not act without written order. She suggested I retain counsel. The irony bit deep. I, who had built furniture that still held families together, now had to pay someone simply to prove that my life was my own. In the evening, I visited Claire. She opened the door with eyes already tired from arguments she hadn't wanted to host. She admitted Vanessa had pressed her hard, insisting the trust was necessary, warning that resistance would harm the family name. Claire said she had refused to sign until she heard directly from me, but she admitted David's pressure was relentless. He had dangled financial support she needed, hinting that refusal would cost her stability. I asked her what she believed, not what she feared. She lowered her eyes, saying she did not want to choose between her father and her brother. I told her she had already been forced to choose. By silence she had chosen their path. She wept quietly, not for guilt alone, but for the chains she knew were tightening around her own ankles. When I left her house, the street was lined with new developments. David's company had built houses with vinyl siding and artificial decks. Neat, but soulless. They stood like a wall against the memory of the town's older homes, where my beams still bore weight. It was clear to me then, this was not only a battle for my dignity, but a battle for the story of the town itself. If Vanessa and David succeeded, my life would be erased from its frame. The following day, a letter arrived. It was formal, bearing the attorney's seal, informing me that several of my assets had been preliminarily recorded under review for transfer. Among them, disturbingly, was the listing of personal property, tools, equipment, and items of historical value. My hand shook not from age, but from anger. The thought of strangers cataloguing the contents of my shop, reducing decades of craft to inventory codes, was more violent than any blow. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my property, touching the fence posts I had set myself, the shed I had raised in a single weekend, the porch boards I had replaced after a storm. Every piece of wood carried a memory. Each nail held a story. None of it belonged to lawyers or signatures. But the storm was closing in, and I knew silence would no longer protect me. I began collecting records, receipts from decades of projects, photographs of finished work, testimonies from neighbors. I knew that soon they would not only come for my money, but for my name. If Vanessa could convince the town that my achievements were exaggerated or false, she would not just strip me of wealth, but of worth. I resolved that the next time she appeared, with her case and her smile, I would not merely resist. I would begin to fight, not with anger, but with proof, the way a carpenter squares a frame before setting the nails. The truth would be my tool, steadier than any signature. That night, before I closed the shop, I took the hand plane from its peg and set it on the workbench. I looked at its handle, worn smooth by my grip, and realized it was no longer just a tool. It was evidence, testimony in wood and steel. If they tried to erase me, this was the object that would speak louder than their contracts. I locked the shop, carried the key in my pocket, and walked home under a sky that promised. Another storm. Sunday settled over the town with the plain light that fills a sanctuary before the first hymn. I took my usual pew, not out of habit, but because the wood had known my weight for years. Eyes shifted, conversations softened, and the air held that thin, quiet people use when they are trying not to stare. The benches I had built were steady. Beneath them, steady beneath me. And that steadiness was the only courtesy I was guaranteed. After the service, the pastor asked me to step into his office. Reverend Thomas, an old friend who had baptized half the town's babies and buried half its fathers, carried calm the way other men carry authority. His manner had been pushed to the edges lately by newer voices and brighter stages, but his steadiness had not dimmed. He closed the door, set a cardboard file box on the desk, and told me he had received letters from my son's attorney and from Vanessa. The church had been asked to review plaques and printed programs where my name appeared as craftsman, especially in the fellowship hall and the nursery wing. The request had been framed as a correction for historical accuracy and a move to prevent confusion. He did not endorse the request. He placed it on the desk and let the paper speak for itself. He said there would also be a community event that week, a heritage presentation hosted by the chamber with David's company as the sponsor. A segment was scheduled for a guest craftsman, Gregory Shaw, to present about traditional joinery and the town's true lineage of craftsmanship. The pastor's tone did not bend toward judgment or sympathy. He stuck to fact, like a man handing over a ledger. He slid the file box toward me and said the church had been cleaning storerooms and came across archived photos, contracts, and bulletins from the years when I had done so much work there. He thought I should have a look before anyone altered anything. He reminded me in simple words that the church would not become an arena for a family quarrel, but it would not erase honest records either. Then he left me alone with the box. Inside lay programs browned at the edges, Polaroids from church dinners, invoices with carbon copies still crisp, and a 1978 report to the building committee that itemized lumber and labor for the fellowship. Cabinets. My name appeared beside the cost of red oak. A notation in the margin thanked me for delivering ahead of schedule despite a snowstorm. The handwriting belonged to the committee chair who had died years ago. Beneath the report lay photos of the finished cabinets, my joints clear even to an untrained eye, the way I nested dovetails, the way I concealed fasteners to let the wood speak. There were also letters from the same period, one from a city contractor, arguing that a certain subcontractor had provided inferior casework in an education wing. I recognized the description. I did not need a name to know who had tried to undercut me back then. I carried the box to my truck like a man moving a fragile instrument through rain. Before driving away, I walked through the hall one more time. People fetched coffee and stood near the cabinets, as if nothing were in dispute. I ran my hand under a shelf and felt the shallow groove, where my marking knife had slipped and where I had sanded but left a trace because wood remembers. No one else would know to look. At home, I spread the contents on my dining table, arranging them by date. Then I opened the newspaper archives on my laptop and searched headlines from those years. A photo from a holiday fundraiser showed a ribbon cutting in the fellowship hall. My face appeared at the edge of the frame, not centered, the way working men show up in history, present, useful, unnamed. But the caption credited the cabinetry to my shop. I printed the page and added it to the pile. The bank called again with neutral words. A compliance officer informed me in a careful voice that a trustee had filed a notice of intent to restructure accounts for estate planning. When I asked on what authority, she said the intent did not execute transfer but could prompt temporary holds. I asked for the law they were following and wrote it down. I told her I would be bringing counsel into the conversation. She responded with a sentence that had no subject, the kind of phrase people use when they want action but not blame. We ended the call understanding each other more than policy allowed us to admit. By midday, a link began passing through town. Feeds for the Chamber's Heritage Talk. The banner carried Gregory's face under soft lighting, his hands posed around a chisel he likely hadn't sharpened in years. The write-up described him as a master who had shaped the town's aesthetic. It named projects I had built. The list read like a theft wearing a borrowed suit. I went to the shop and pulled out 3 drawers of invoices. I found duplicates of receipts for the church work, for doors at the library, for a restoration in the oldest house on Maple. Each had dates, signatures, amounts, and notes scribbled by me late at night when the phone didn't ring and the radio kept me honest. I stacked them, added the printed news page, and photographed each with timestamps. Proof needs order to be believed. A truck rolled into my lane near mid-afternoon. 2 men stepped out with clipboards and a shared expression used by people sent to do polite trespass. They introduced themselves as property consultants working with David's company. They said they had been asked to inventory items of value on site as part of a consolidation that would benefit me. They used my first name without asking permission. I told them to leave. They pointed to a printed email in a plastic sleeve and said a family trust held an interest. I said interest was not ownership. They kept smiling the way people smile when they assume a sheriff's paper stands behind them, even when they have none. I stood in the doorway with my hands in plain view, and they decided the photos they had already taken through the window would have to be enough. On their way out, one of them photographed the pegboard where my hand plane hung. He thought it was an antique curiosity. It was a record of a life. I received an email alert that evening from an online consignment house. A listing had gone live for vintage woodworking tools from the Monroe estate, with a preview of items labeled pending family confirmation. The first image was my hand plane, the second my marking gauges, the third a mallet I had made out of hickory that survived 3 remodels and 1 move. The description read like a eulogy written by someone in a hurry. I sent a cease notice through the site, attached proof of ownership, and saved the page before they could edit it. The listing had been submitted by a user connected to David's office address. The next day, the chamber event filled the town hall. I stood at the back because my place had been moved there without anyone saying it out loud. People glanced and then pretended they hadn't. My son walked the aisle like a man taking measurements at an open house. His attention on donors, not on the foundations. Vanessa coordinated a queue of introductions, handshakes, flashbulbs. When Gregory took the stage, he presented slides of projects he described as his. The angles gave him cover. If a man crops a photo tightly enough, he can make your mark look like his. He gestured to a joint on a screen and spoke about refinement. I watched the way the pieces met and knew what the angle of my chisel had been that day, the way my wrist turned near the end to avoid tear out. A man recognizes his own work the way he knows his own gait in a crowd. Neighbors applauded politely, because that is what people do at sponsored events. A councilman congratulated the town on preserving its heritage. I felt the wall of sound push me backward. I stepped into the hallway, where framed photos from old festivals lined the paneled wall. In one frame, my shop's sign appeared in the background behind the 4th of July parade. A child sat on a curb and licked a cone. The shadow of my awning cut diagonally across his shoulder. No caption mentioned the awning. The small truths. Never make labels. On my way out, I found Reverend Thomas near the doorway, greeting people with his usual quiet. He did not make speeches. He told me the church had scheduled a committee meeting to review the request about the plaques. He said he had placed my name on the agenda. He also told me that if I had documents, they should come with me. There was no sermon in his voice, only a reminder that rooms where records are kept can still hold justice if someone carries paper in at the right hour. That evening, I returned to the church when the classrooms were empty and the hall was quiet. The pastor unlocked the fellowship cabinets so I could examine them without a crowd. He stayed by the door and busied himself with a stack of hymnals, leaving me alone with the wood. I kneeled and ran my fingers along the underside until I felt the faint curve where my knife had once nicked. I pressed my phone flat and took pictures with the light on, capturing the tool marks others would miss. At the far left corner, against the wall, I reached into the seam and felt the shallow notch I had carved years ago when I hid my initials where only a craftsman would think to look. The habit had never been about pride. It was about accountability. If a seam failed, I wanted to know by my mark so I could fix what was mine. My initials were there, barely raised under a thin layer of finish. I photographed them in 3 angles and then placed a slip of paper into the seam to preserve the spot. No one else would see the paper. but I would know where to return if the mark was contested. The next morning, a police cruiser idled at the curb when I stepped outside. The officer explained he was performing a wellness check requested by a concerned relative. He looked embarrassed to be the messenger of a theatre piece dressed as care. I invited him in, showed him my pantry, my medications in order, my calendar with appointments circled. He thanked me, apologized with his eyes for the intrusion his badge required, and left. The sound of the engine receding was the sound of a line being tested for weak points. At noon, I met a lawyer recommended by a neighbor, whose roof I had replaced at cost when his wife was sick. The attorney was young enough to find digital archives, faster than I could turn a page, but old enough to keep his questions short. I placed the church files, the invoices, the printed headlines, and the photos of my mark on the table. He asked practical questions: chain of custody, dates, who had access to the cabinets, who would be at the committee meeting. He did not promise to fix anything. He promised to show up with me and take notes. That was enough. On my way home, I stopped by the hardware store that had survived the new developments like a stubborn oak between glass offices. The owner pointed me to a display of small safes and fireproof folders. He didn't ask why I needed them. I bought 2 and a roll of painter's tape. At the shop, I sealed copies of my proof inside and hid them in places no one would think to look, under the false bottom of a tool chest, behind a panel that looked glued but wasn't. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet work of protecting what is true. That evening the church held a weekday dinner for volunteers. I attended not to be seen, but because I wanted to test how quickly stories travel. The bulletin board near the kitchen had a new draft of signage for the fellowship hall. The language had changed in a small but potent way. Where my name had once sat as builder, the new version credited a local craftsman, undefined. Line at the bottom proposed acknowledging Gregory's contributions to the town's tradition. The paper had not been pinned with finality. It was the kind of draft that appears before a vote to see if anyone notices. I did not pull it down. I wrote the date in my mind and filed the moment beside the others. On my way out, I placed my palm flat against the cabinet for one breath. Not a prayer, not a plea. The wood was solid, square, level. Good work does not wobble when politics leans on it. In my pocket, my phone held the photos. In my bag, the folder held the reports. On my calendar, a committee meeting had a circle. Around it, between those points, lay the narrow path a man can walk when others try to move him off his foundation. Back at the house, a new message blinked on my phone from the consignment site, confirming that the disputed tool listings had been paused pending proof. A second message from the bank noted that my request for policy citations had been forwarded to legal. A third from the chamber thanked attendees and linked to a photo gallery in which my son stood beside Gregory, both smiling as if they had lifted the town on their shoulders. The captions referred to restoring rightful credit. The words were clean. The intent was not. I set the phone face down and opened my ledger. I logged the copies I had made, the calls placed, the receipts gathered. In one margin, I wrote a single note: show, don't tell. A craftsman knows the difference. You do not persuade a wall to stand. You make it square and plumb until it cannot fall without revealing where the cheat began. They had turned the church into a stage for revision. I had turned it back into a shop where marks on wood could outlast performance. The week would bring more requests, more forms, more smiling threats dressed as kindness. I did not have to outshout them. I only had to make the record louder than their claims. The first time I saw my granddaughter after the storm began. She arrived unannounced, a figure walking down the lane with a backpack slung over one shoulder and determination in her step. Anna was 19, caught between the lives of two generations, carrying the unfiltered honesty that comes when a young person has not yet learned to disguise conviction. She pushed open the shop door and called my name like she always had as a child, not as a visitor seeking permission, but as family reclaiming a place. She set the backpack on the bench and asked me straight out if the things she had heard at school were true, that her uncle claimed another man had built the cabinets in the church, that her grandfather had been removed from his accounts, that some people whispered he might not be her mother's real father. She asked, not with doubt, but with urgency, like someone desperate to know where the ground still held firm. I told her lies have short legs, but they travel fast. I showed her the drawers of receipts, the invoices stamped with dates, the photographs Reverend Thomas had returned to me. She studied them in silence, her fingers tracing the numbers and names as though the paper itself could teach her. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out an old spiral-bound notebook. She explained that she had been assigned a local history project for a college seminar and had chosen to write about the town's buildings. While digging in the school archives, she had stumbled upon a folder labeled with my shop's name, half forgotten among dusty yearbooks. Inside were photos of half-finished structures, blueprints marked with initials, and margin notes that looked like mine. She brought them to me because she wanted confirmation. When I opened the notebook, the sight of my own scrawl from decades earlier hit harder than any accusation David had hurled. The sketches were mine the way I curved an M, the shorthand I used for measurements. In the margins I had written reminders to myself, notes only a craftsman would make. One page listed a set of doors for the courthouse annex, with a line reminding me to cut an extra hinge mortise to correct for a warped jamb. I remembered the project as clearly as I remembered the ache in my shoulders that winter. Yet the official record now credited the annex work to Gregory. Anna sat watching me, waiting for me to affirm what she already suspected, that truth had been buried. I nodded and told her she had uncovered what others tried to erase. She pressed me further. Why would her uncle do this? Why would her family allow it? I did not speak against her mother or her uncle in that moment. I simply told her that sometimes ambition blinds people to the cost of what they destroy. Later that week, an auction notice appeared online with photos of tools labeled estate liquidation. Among them was my hand plane, unmistakable from the curve of its worn handle. I had not given consent for any sale. When I saw the image, my chest tightened. That tool had carved not only wood, but also the path of my life. To see it priced as if it were just another trinket at a flea market was more brutal than any insult spoken aloud. I printed the listing and laid it on the workbench. Anna, still with me, stared at the picture with disbelief. She whispered that selling something so personal was not only theft but cruelty. She offered to confront David, to call out the fraud directly. I stopped her. I told her recklessness feeds the fire of liars, but patience arms the truth. She did not like it, but she listened. News traveled fast in a town like ours. Within days, I overheard neighbors speculating that my accounts were under control of guardians because I could not manage them myself. One man at the diner remarked that perhaps it was time the next generation took the reins. He said it in the tone of someone who believed efficiency mattered more than loyalty. I left my breakfast half-eaten on the counter, unwilling to sit where falsehoods were treated as common sense. Back at the shop, Anna searched through cabinets I had not opened in years. She found envelopes stuffed with receipts, yellowed sketches, even Polaroids of half-finished work. In one box, she uncovered a photograph of Gregory standing beside a frame wall, smiling as if he had built it. But the writing on the back was mine, dated, noting that he had shown up late and done nothing useful before posing for the camera. Proof lay not only in what was written, but in what was captured unintentionally. My chalk marks on the studs, my square leaning against the wall, the measurements scrawled on scraps of paper at my feet. She asked if I would let her scan these materials, organize them digitally so they could not vanish. At first I hesitated. Paper had always been my ally. It carried weight, it could be touched. But she reminded me that the people working against me used modern channels, auctions, emails, digital records to advance their version. If I stayed, in paper alone, I would be outpaced. Reluctantly, I agreed. She spent hours photographing each page with her phone, uploading them to folders, labeling them carefully. Watching her work, I felt both pride and sorrow. Pride that she cared enough to protect me. Sorrow that it had become necessary. The following Sunday, during the service, Gregory stood to give a guest lecture about the legacy of true craftsmanship. His voice carried through the sanctuary, confident and polished, rehearsed like a speech meant for donors. He spoke of the courthouse annex, of the fellowship hall, of the library renovations, all projects I had sweated over. Each, he claimed, as his. When he paused for effect, people nodded as if history itself had been clarified. I gripped the back of the pew so tightly my knuckles whitened. Afterward, Anna approached him in the foyer and asked in a clear voice why his initials were absent from any of the documents she had seen in the archives. He chuckled and said, "Records. Get lost. That oral tradition sometimes speaks louder than paperwork." He patted her shoulder as if she were a child who had wandered into adult affairs. She pulled back, fire in her eyes, but she held her tongue. She walked to me instead, her jaw set. She whispered that we had to fight, not only with documents, but with presence. That silence in public felt like surrender. That night, sitting in the shop, she told me she intended to testify if ever the matter came before the council or a court. She wanted to say she had seen the evidence herself, that she had witnessed the deceit. I told her her voice mattered, not because of blood, but because she represented the future that would inherit this town. She was not bound by old grudges or contracts. She wanted only to protect truth. The days that followed carried heavier blows. David sent word through an attorney that I was prohibited from direct contact with Anna, citing concerns for her emotional well-being. The phrasing was venom wrapped in legal cotton. To cut a grandfather from his granddaughter under the guise of care was a cruelty even I had not expected. When Anna learned of the restriction, she came anyway, slipping through the side door of the shop like she had as a child. She refused to let paper dictate affection. She said if they dragged her into a courtroom, she would tell the judge exactly who was manipulating whom. Her defiance fueled me. With her help, I compiled a binder thick with documents, photos, and timelines. Each page marked a nail in the frame. Of truth, we set duplicates in safes, hid copies in separate locations, even mailed one set to Reverend Thomas for safekeeping. I no longer felt alone in the fight. The presence of one determined granddaughter outweighed the betrayal of a son and the schemes of an ambitious daughter-in-law. But one night, after she left for campus, I sat alone at the bench and stared at the empty peg, where the handplane had hung before the listing appeared. I had removed it myself, for safety, hidden it away, but the absence on the wall still felt like an amputation. That gap embodied the war we were in, a life reduced to voids, to missing pieces, two stories retold by liars until absence seemed natural. I swore then that no auction, no signature, no speech would close the story of my life without the mark of my hand in the final line. Anna's arrival had reminded me that truth could skip a generation and still survive. If the world intended to erase me, I would carve my name again, not in boasts or anger, but in proof so solid that even time would hesitate to sand it away. The rumors did not just grow, they multiplied like weeds left unchecked in a neglected yard. By the time autumn settled in, whispers carried my name attached to doubts that cut deeper than any blade. Gregory stood taller at every public event, and his voice always found its way into gatherings where I was absent. He painted himself as the forgotten craftsman, the one who had supposedly carried the burden of projects others took credit for. People who once shook my hand with respect now looked at me with sidelong pity, as if they wondered whether I had built my reputation on borrowed work. Then came the strike I never saw coming. Gregory, with the smooth confidence of a man rehearsed, Elias told a gathering of townsfolk that he and my late wife had once been more than acquaintances. He spoke of it casually, as though sharing an open secret, leaving the implication heavy in the air. He did not shout it, he whispered it in corners, letting others carry the poison for him. It spread in the way gossip always does, half suspected, half believed. Impossible to pin down, but unavoidable in its sting. The cruelest part was not that he sullied her memory, but that he used the claim to question David's blood. He suggested, in measured tones, that maybe the son I had raised was his own. He never said it outright. He planted the idea and let others repeat it. At first, I wanted to dismiss it as noise. But when I overheard my own daughter hesitating before answering a friend who asked about her mother's faithfulness, I knew the seed had taken root. The man who introduced himself as the true father had gone beyond slandering my work. He had invaded my home through the cracks of memory and was tearing apart what little trust remained between me and my children. My wife had been gone for over a decade. She could not defend herself, and David, who should have rejected such a claim, instead stood beside Gregory, never denying it, allowing doubt to grow because it served his ambition. I saw him one evening outside the courthouse, speaking to a group of investors. Gregory hovered at his side, smiling like a mentor. They laughed together while I stood across the street, watching the reflection of myself in the courthouse glass. A man others now called questionable. It was not the weight of strangers' suspicion that crushed me most, it was the look of satisfaction on my son's face, as if erasing me gave him stature. When I returned to the shop that night, Anna was already there. She had heard the rumors at school, the cruel suggestion that the man claiming my son was his own father had spoken truth. She looked at me not with doubt but with fire, demanding to know how such venom could be answered. I told her the truth, that her grandmother had been faithful, that no amount of lies could change blood. She believed me, but belief in private was not enough. The town was feasting on slander like it was bread at supper. The next morning, a formal notice arrived from David's attorney. It claimed concern for my mental state, citing erratic behavior and confusion that put family assets at risk. Attached was a petition for guardianship. Granted, it would strip me of financial control, leaving my life in the hands of my son and his wife. And there it was, the signature of my daughter, Claire, pressed in ink at the bottom. Her Hesitation had given way to compliance. She had been cornered, pressured, or perhaps convinced. I did not know. What I did know was that my own child had lent her name to the effort to declare me unfit. I set the papers on the bench and stared at them until the daylight shifted across the floor. Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of my independence. If they succeeded, I would become a guest in my own life, stripped of decision, reduced to a ward under the control of those who had already tried to sell my tools and silence my voice. Anna returned later that day. She saw the documents, read them line by line, and trembled with anger. She swore she would testify to my clarity, to my memory, to the way I could recount dates and projects with precision. She said she would not let them erase me the way they had tried to erase my work. I listened to her, grateful, but I also knew how courts worked. Influence and perception carry weight heavier than truth. If the community believed Gregory's lies, if the town saw me as fading, then even the sharpest testimony from a granddaughter might be ignored. Gregory knew exactly where to strike. He had lived long enough to understand that legacy is not destroyed in a single blow. It is dismantled piece by piece until those watching begin to believe the collapse is natural. He was taking my family one by one, setting them against me. Using doubt as his hammer, David aligned with him for ambition. Claire bent under the pressure of divided loyalty. Even the town, once proud of my work, now muttered suspicions behind closed doors. One evening, I found myself walking past the church alone. The sanctuary lights glowed through the stained glass, and inside, Gregory's voice rose in confident tones. He was speaking again, this time about truths long buried and the strength of blood that cannot be denied. His words were careful, designed to echo the rumor without saying it outright. Parishioners nodded, some with sympathy, others with smugness, as if they were in possession of knowledge hidden from fools. I stood outside, listening, invisible in the shadows of the oak trees. Every sentence was another brick placed in the wall being built around me, but walls can also be dismantled. Back at the shop, Anna sat at the bench, scanning more of my documents. She uncovered an envelope marked with the year David was born. Inside were receipts for the hospital, notes in my hand about the night of his birth, and a photograph of me holding him, no older than an infant swaddled in blankets. In the picture, his mother's tired smile shone, her hand resting on mine. The photograph carried more truth than Gregory's tongue ever could. Anna held it like a weapon and said the time for hiding had passed. I realized then that our fight was not just about buildings or tools. It was about blood, about memory, about refusing to let liars draw the map of our family. They had already filed papers to strip me of decision. They had already spread rumors that stained the grave of my wife. If we did not act, they would succeed in turning me into a shadow before death even came for me. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the bench, the guardianship papers in front of me, the photograph of David as a newborn beside them. I thought of the years I had carried him on my shoulders, the hours teaching him to hold a chisel, the nights working late so he could attend better schools than I ever dreamed of. To have all of that dismissed in favor of a man who had been absent, a man whose bitterness had fermented into this campaign, was not merely betrayal, it was erasure. I swore to myself then that I would not allow it. They could spread their poison, but I would not drink it. I would build a record stronger than lies, one that no court could dismiss and no rumor could overshadow. Anna had given me the courage to see the fight for what it was, not just survival, but defiance. And so, with hands still steady, I began to prepare for the reckoning that would come. They did not send a note. They sent a catalogue, a glossy email. Arrived before sunrise, with photos laid out like trophies, each numbered lot paired with a brief, cheerful description. The subject line called it an estate reallocation event. My shop was reduced to thumbnails and starting bids. The hand plane was lot 12, labelled as a vintage piece from a private collection. Private meant me. Collection meant life. I drove to the warehouse where these kinds of afternoons happen under bright lights that make everything look new and impersonal. The parking lot was already half full. Vans with dealer logos idled near the loading doors. Inside, folding tables ran in long rows, covered in felt. Taglines promised authenticity, provenance, and responsible stewardship. People moved with the quiet greed of buyers who convince themselves they are rescuing artifacts when they are merely acquiring them. Vanessa stood near the registration desk in a black suit, efficient as a head nurse, greeting people by first name. David worked the room like a host who believes hospitality is a weapon. He gestured at items as if narrating a tour through a museum that had never been built. Gregory hovered beside him, perfectly placed for introductions, the man whose name he wanted others to remember when mine was gone. Claire was there too, at the edge, neither leaving nor joining, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched. In her eyes, a question paced a small room with no door. The hand plane lay in a glass case under a white lamp. The card called it an example of regional craftsmanship, maker unknown. It was presented on a strip of clean maple I recognized from my own off-cut bin. Someone had staged the object with care, the way a collector arranges a family portrait that excludes inconvenient relatives. I asked the attendant for the preview tag, and the case slid open. The plane sat warm in my palm, heavier than memory, lighter than the weight it carried now. The handle's curve fit my hand like it had been carved for it, because it had. My fingerprint still lived in the polished dot. An auctioneer in a red tie rehearsed his cadence at the microphone, voice a steady engine. He thanked the sponsor, my son's company, for supporting the preservation of local heritage. The irony was complete. A photographer moved through the crowd, taking pictures of bidders, pointing at things they did not understand. Gregory leaned into frame whenever a lens rose, practiced and ready. I sought the manager and presented a folder with proof of ownership receipts, photographs, the hidden mark on the cabinet's seam at the church, handwritten notes. He listened with the polite distance of a man who knows his paycheck, argues with facts. He said the sale was authorized by a trustee. He pointed to a stack of papers on a clipboard bearing my last name and a signature line filled by someone else. The words said my best interest had been considered. The phrase had become the slow knife used to cut the skin from my life. Anna was not allowed inside under the notice. David's attorney had sent, but she appeared in the doorway anyway, a silhouette. That told me help had come whether invited or not. She stayed at the back, phone in hand, recording quietly, her face set. Vanessa noticed her, whispered a direction to security, then thought better of causing a scene. Optics mattered when you sold a man's life. The auction began with small items to warm the room. A mallet I'd made from hickory went first, described as primitive. A set of marking gauges followed, called decorative. A bidder near the front lifted a numbered card each time, as if checking a box on a list. The numbers rose, the hammer fell, and the crowd settled into the rhythm of transfer. It was not theft. It was ritual. When lot 12 was announced, the room tilted. The plane drew people to the case like heat. The auctioneer recited the card, mispronounced the term for the iron, and told a story about unnamed pioneers in a voice designed to make strangers feel like descendants. Bidders positioned themselves with room to raise a hand if they liked the sound of history more than the cost of it. I asked to examine the plane once more before the bidding. The attendant hesitated, checked with Vanessa, received a small nod meant for show, and opened the case. I lifted the wedge, loosened the lever cap, tilted the blade to the light on. The underside of the cap iron, hidden where no one looks unless they have tuned the tool. A shallow engraving curved along the steel. My initials, cut by my hand with a graver years ago to keep track of which iron belonged to which body. I did not announce the mark like a showman. I simply cleaned it with a cloth and placed the parts back together with the confidence of someone who knows a thing's correct order. Then I set a scrap of maple on the table and ran the plane across the grain in one smooth pass. The blade whispered. A ribbon curled and fell over the edge like a white banner surrendering to gravity. For a heartbeat, the room went quiet, as if the shaving had cut sound as well as wood. That, more than any paper, was proof. A tool in the right hands declares the truth of its owner. The hush did not last. The auctioneer, trained never to let stillness win, filled the space with numbers. Bidding opened low and rose quickly, hands darting up from buyers who wanted what they had just seen work. I lifted my number. My card was accepted. My presence was tolerated as long as it served the show. Another hand beat mine. I raised again. The increments stepped up. The attendant nodded each increase, face neutral. I reached a threshold where the bid matched the cost of a month's living in this small town. I kept going because the object on the table was not only steel and wood, it was time. The auctioneer glanced at the clerk and announced the availability of phone bids. A new number entered, unseen, distant. The room felt the shift in power, only the way a temperature changes before rain. The price jumped. I raised my card again. The unseen voice raised from elsewhere. I reached for my wallet and felt the weight of a card I knew would not answer. I tried anyway. The manager returned it with an apology that sounded like policy. I had cash, but not enough to outrun a phantom with a bank behind it. A buyer near the front turned to see who kept pushing the number. He studied my face, calculated the story, and lowered his card, perhaps out of decency, perhaps out of fear of joining a spectacle. The phone bidder did not tire. The increments grew aggressive. Vanessa stood with arms folded in quiet satisfaction, the expression of someone who prefers victories recorded in ledger lines. David looked past me, his jaw set in the posture of a son convinced that breaking a father is a necessary modernizing. The hammer fell to the phone. The auctioneer announced the price with the bounce of a man proud of his craft. The clerk wrote the buyer's name on a tag and attached it to the base of the case. The buyer of Lot 12 was not a person, but a foundation with a careful title that included the word heritage and the surname Shaw. The room resumed its chatter as if nothing other than money had changed hands. In truth, something heavier shifted ownership of a symbol, custody of a life. I did not cause a scene. No one would remember an old man's protest as anything other than noise. Instead, I recorded the moment like a builder records plumb lines. The photograph Anna took from the doorway captured the shaving still draped on the table, the tag being placed, Vanessa's smile trimmed to a blade, David's profile hard, Gregory's reflection in the glass of the case like a second face behind the first. The image told a story that the caption could not sanitize. Claire approached the case after the sale with a small movement of her hand that meant, "Stop this if you can," and with the other meant, "I cannot." Her eyes settled on the plane for a long second before she stepped back. She had chosen, not loudly but completely, the way people choose by letting events happen. A staffer carried the case to the back to prepare it for shipping. I watched it leave the floor as if watching a hearse door close. Outside, I stood by the loading dock as trucks backed to the bay. The crate for Lot 12 was labeled with a destination in another state. It would be a month, perhaps less, before. The plane sat in a room where strangers would point and talk about regional work in generalities, while credit lines under plaques told a revised story. A man can lose a thing to the wind and accept it because the wind owes no one an explanation. To lose something to paperwork is different. Paper looks you in the eye and says the change is for the best. On my way to the shop, I stopped at the church. The building committee was setting up chairs for a meeting. Reverend Thomas saw me and inclined his head without ceremony. The draft of signage still hung on the bulletin board, credit reduced to vagueness. I took a seat in the back and waited. The committee called the meeting to order, read the request to alter plaques, and opened the floor. I did not stand to speak. The rules did not require me to, and the room did not want speeches. I placed copies of photographs on the table, my initials inside the cabinet's seam, the invoices, the newspaper clipping with the caption naming my shop. Facts sat quietly and refused to move. That is how truth behaves when it is tired of being chased, the committee conferred. They did not declare victory for me or for those who wanted the plaques changed. They tabled the decision until verification could be completed. Delay can be a weapon when it serves the powerful. Sometimes it can be a shield. In that pause, the plane had been sold, but the record had not yet been rewritten. I held to the difference the way a man holds to a beam he knows will hold even if the wall around it fails. That night, the warehouse posted an album from the auction. One photo caught me at the table, making the long shaving, the ribbon curling into air. The caption called it a demonstration of tool condition. People shared the image, not for the caption, but for the curve of that single strip of wood falling. Like a quiet verdict, the object in the case could travel. The proof in the air had already moved. I slept little. When dawn came, I returned to the workbench and placed a board of maple across it. I set an old backup plane, one that had never left the shop, and tuned it to a hair. I pulled a pass and watched the shaving lay itself down, obedient and clean. Then I packed the binder Anna and I had assembled, the photos from the church, the bank policies the compliance officer had sent, and the invoice copies. The sale of the plane could not be reversed by sorrow. It could be addressed by record, by law, by pressure applied at the correct joints. Mid-morning, I received an email confirming shipment of Lot 12 to the Foundation's address. Attached was a receipt with the buyer's name and the initials of the staff who had prepared the crate. Mistakes happen when people hurry. The file trail included a forwarded note from Vanessa's account to a man with a Shore domain, thanking him for supporting the event and for preserving the story. The word preserve sat in the sentence like a cracked support under a heavy load. I forwarded the email to the attorney who had agreed to stand beside me without promises. I attached the photographs and asked him plainly what could be done. He replied with a measured outline, an emergency motion to challenge the transfer, a notice to the Foundation that title was disputed, a request to freeze any display or resale until a hearing. He said we might not win at all, but we could slow the machinery long enough to force eyes onto the record I had built before noon. I drove back to the warehouse and asked for a copy of the public buyer list, citing open record policies they bragged about in their brochure. The clerk handed me a sheet without argument. The name of the foundation sat in black ink beside lot 12. I took a photograph of the page and tucked it into my binder. Proof had a new corner. On the way out, I paused by the glass case, now sitting empty on the felt. A faint curl of maple still clung to the edge. I lifted it carefully and slid it into the ledger I carried everywhere now. The page closed over it like a seal. The hand plane was gone for the moment, boxed and rolling toward a room where my enemies would stand beside it. A nod. But the ribbon stayed with me, weightless and undeniable. The image of that curl would travel faster than a crate. The sound it had made soft, perfect, kept playing in the heads of people who had witnessed it. They had seen what an honest tool does in the right hands. They had staged a victory. I had staged a record. When I reached the shop, I hung an empty outline on the peg where the plane had rested, a simple rectangle of painter's tape framing absence. It was not an act of mourning. It was a measurement, a reminder that a missing piece can guide the rebuild. I wrote beneath it in pencil a single line, to be returned. Then I locked the door, checked the safes, and set the binder by the exit. The fight had moved beyond rumor and into paperwork, where I could meet it with my own. The day they sold my hand back to me, I learned two things. First, that those who trade in appearances will always call theft preservation. Second, that a clean-shaving, falling in silence speaks louder than any speech a man like Gregory can deliver. Let them ship the crate and polish the plaque. I had put the town's eyes on the one thing they could not edit, the way real work looks when it moves. The letter arrived folded in a stiff envelope stamped with a courthouse seal. I slit it open with a chisel, unwilling to touch it with anything else. The words inside declared that a hearing would be held to determine my mental competence. Petition had been filed by my own blood, supported by testimony and affidavits I had not been shown. The date was set for the following week. If the court agreed, guardianship would be granted. The name suggested to serve as guardian was my daughter's, Claire. Came to me that evening, standing on the porch where we once watched storms roll in. Her voice trembled, though not from lack of conviction. They told me it was for your protection. If I don't sign, they'll say I'm ignoring your needs. She held a folder at her side, papers waiting for her signature. She looked not like a traitor, but like a prisoner asked to choose her own chains. I asked her if she believed I was incapable. She shook her head before the word left my lips, but her silence afterward was louder than denial. The pressure around her was heavy enough to bend her spine. Vanessa's hand was in it, David's voice urging, Gregory whispering in the background. Claire had been placed in a corner and told to justify it as duty. I refused to beg. A father begging his child not to erase him is a sight no one should see. Instead, I asked her to sit. I laid the ledger open on the table, showing the photographs Anna had gathered, the receipts, the letters from years back, the testimony Reverend Thomas had agreed to give. Evidence lay like planks ready for assembly. I told her she could choose what to sign, but she could not choose what was true. Her hands trembled as she closed the folder without opening it, whispering that she needed time. Time, I knew, was the one thing they wanted to deny me. The days before the hearing stretched thin. I worked not in wood, but in paper, binding proof. together with staples instead of glue. Anna came nightly, slipping through the back door with her phone full of new finds. She had unearthed an old photograph from a local fair. Gregory standing behind one of my displays, passing off my designs as his own. The date stamped on the print placed it years before his supposed connection to my family. She printed the image, and I added it to the growing binder. Each page was another nail driven into the coffin of his story. On the morning of the hearing, I wore the same coat I had worn to my wife's funeral. It was threadbare, but it carried weight. The courthouse smelled of polish and paper, the air stale with judgment. David sat with Vanessa at his side, their expressions rehearsed. Gregory leaned in the back row, eyes bright as if watching a performance he had paid to attend. Claire sat apart, her folder unopened, her face pale as stone. The judge entered, and the room rose. Proceedings began with statements read by David's attorney, words arranged to paint me as confused, unstable, unsafe. They claimed I had lost track of my finances, that I had wandered, that I had resisted reasonable decisions about my care. They cited the sale of the plane as proof I could not manage property responsibly. The irony landed like an axe. They had orchestrated the sale, then used it as evidence of my incompetence. When my turn came, I did not speak at length. Instead, I opened the binder and laid it on the table. I showed photographs, invoices, the engraving on the iron, the newspaper articles, with my name. I produced letters from suppliers, affidavits from apprentices who were trained in my shop. Reverend Thomas stepped forward, steady in his collar, to confirm what the church still held hidden marks in the cabinets, proof of my hand. Each piece was a beam fitted into place until the frame of the truth stood on its own. The judge watched quietly, eyes moving over the documents. Then he turned to Claire. She had been asked to serve as guardian, and her word carried weight. The attorney prompted her. She opened her folder, the papers inside waiting for her signature. She lifted her pen, hand shaking. Then she dropped it. Her voice cracked as she said, "I will not sign." The silence that followed was louder than any gavel. Vanessa hissed something under her breath. David's jaw clenched, his knuckles white. Against the armrest, Gregory shifted in his seat, the first crack of unease appearing across his mask. Claire stood, trembling but steady in her words. "My father is not incompetent. He remembers more than all of us put together. If you want to erase him, you'll do it without my help." The judge noted her refusal. He did not dismiss the case entirely, but he denied the petition for guardianship, citing insufficient evidence of incapacity. The hearing adjourned. For that moment, I remained my own man. As we stepped outside, the cold air bit with clarity. Claire stood beside me, guilt heavy on her shoulders, but she had chosen. She whispered, "They won't stop." I told her I knew. Survival was not about stopping storms, it was about standing when they passed. That night, Anna brought another discovery, a letter Gregory had written decades ago, tucked in the back of an archive at the local historical society. It was addressed to a supplier detailing designs he planned to present as his own. The sketches matched my blueprints line for line. Proof again, stacked higher. They had tried to strip me of legal standing, to paint me as unfit. They failed, but they would try. Again, in new ways, sharper ways. The war was not over, but a battle had been won. My daughter had refused to become their tool. My granddaughter was building the archive of truth, and I, though bent, was still upright. When I returned to my shop, The empty outline of the plane still marked the wall. Beneath it, I placed the binder, thick with proof, heavier now than any tool I had ever made. It was no longer just evidence, it was a shield. I knew what came next. Gregory would not forgive the fracture. David and Vanessa would turn their anger into new strategies, but they had shown their hand. They could not defeat me by strength or skill. They had to lie, forge, manipulate. That was weakness, not power. As I turned off the lights, the moonlight struck the taped outline of the missing plane. The pencil words I had written weeks before to be returned stood out pale against the wood. I repeated them softly, to myself, not as a wish but as a promise. The tool was gone, my name contested, my bloodline split, yet the truth, like the grain in a board, ran straight beneath the surface. No matter how many cuts they tried to make, the next move was mine. And for the first time in months, I felt steady enough to make it. The town hall was full, packed tighter than it had been for any festival, service, or parade I could remember. Every face from the church pews, every hand that once bought my cabinets, every neighbor who had whispered about my supposed decline was present. David had called them there, certain he would seal my downfall under the glow of community eyes. Gregory stood tall at his side, arms crossed. A look of satisfaction spread across his face like varnish on rotting wood. Vanessa's smile gleamed sharp as glass. I walked in with the binder under my arm, Anna and Claire flanking me. Reverend Thomas had arrived earlier, insisting he speak as witness to what he knew. My steps did not falter. My joints ached, yes, but not from fear. It was time to build my case as I once built beams, with precision, with strength, with permanence. David began with bravado. He spoke of legacy, of blood, of truths withheld. He pointed to Gregory, calling him father before the crowd, claiming I had stolen not only my son's heritage, but another man's honor. He raised the documents Vanessa had so carefully prepared, forged lines of ink meant to bury 50 years of work. The audience murmured, some nodding, some skeptical. It was the show they had been waiting for. When the time was given to me, I did not argue with anger. I opened the binder and set it upon the podium. One displayed the photographs Anna had uncovered, Gregory standing in the background of fairs where my work was shown, his hands resting on designs that were mine. I revealed letters with his handwriting, boasting to suppliers about plans he had plagiarized. Reverend Thomas read aloud from records held in the church notations carved into pews. Signatures inside cabinet drawers, marks only I could have made. Each page turned was another strike against their story. I lifted a broken cabinet handle, saved from years ago, with my initials burned beneath the finish. I spoke plainly. These works are not claims. They are not stories. They are wood and iron, built by hand, built by me. Gregory took them once, and now he takes my name. But truth is heavier than lies. It lasts. The room shifted. Murmurs turned into silence. Gregory's composure cracked, sweat glistening across his forehead. David's voice rose, trying to smother my evidence with louder words. But louder did not mean stronger than came. The final piece, the pawn shop receipt, dated weeks earlier, showing the sale of my plane. Anna stepped forward with the item in her arms. She had bought it back with her own savings, worn but intact. When she placed it in my hands before the crowd, the weight settled into my palms like the heartbeat of a life restored. This, I said, lifting it high, is not wood and iron. This is a man's story. My story. You cannot sell it. You cannot sign it away. You cannot call it another's. You may deny a father, but you cannot erase his work. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was recognition. The judge, present for the proceedings, nodded once, slow and deliberate. Reverend. Thomas whispered a prayer under his breath. Claire's hand gripped mine, tight with resolve. Anna's eyes gleamed, steady and fierce. Gregory broke first. His voice cracked as he shouted, calling me a thief, a liar, his accusations collapsing under the evidence displayed. He demanded the crowd believe him, but the more he spoke, the clearer his desperation became. David turned, pale, realizing his ally was crumbling. Vanessa pulled at his arm, urging retreat, but he stood frozen, trapped between pride and ruin. When the hearing adjourned, the verdict was clear. My name remained intact, my competence affirmed, my work restored as mine. Gregory, stripped of his mask, left in shame. David walked out without a word, shoulders bent. Marriage to Vanessa visibly fraying under the weight of their failure. I remained standing in that hall, the plane in my hand, the binder on the podium. I had not shouted, I had not begged, I had simply laid out truth, plank by plank, until no lie could stand against it. Later that night, sitting in my shop with the lights low, I reflected, for months. I had been dragged through mud by my own son, betrayed in ways a father never imagines. They sold my tools, called me unfit, tried to write me out of my own story. But I learned something cold and solid, something I wish I had known earlier. Family is not proof of loyalty. Blood does not guarantee respect. What holds weight are actions, choices, and the evidence of who you are when pressed against the wall. I had once believed that love alone could protect me, that raising children, providing, building, would bind them to me with gratitude. That was my mistake. Gratitude is not inherited. It must be chosen, and sometimes it is never chosen at all. The lesson I take is not gentle, but it is real. When those closest to you try to erase you, you must build again from what cannot be stolen. Work, truth, memory, these are stronger than betrayal. And if you endure long enough, if you stand without breaking, those who meant to bury you will trip over the foundation you laid. To anyone watching who has been dismissed, betrayed, or told you are less than what you know you are, do not waste yourself on begging for acknowledgement. Do not hand over your worth in the hope it will be honored. Gather what you have, your proof, your work, your quiet strength. Use it, build with it. The ones who try to erase you will not win if you refuse to vanish. I speak now as a man who has seen honor stripped and returned. You are not finished unless you lay yourself down, and I will not. Neither should you. If this story has reached you, if it has given you a fragment of strength, stay with me. There are more battles to face, more truths to tell. Subscribe so you'll walk with me into the next one. We are not done yet.